Welcome back. Inspectors General could keep working even if the government shuts down again. And one member of Congress wants IGs across government to evaluate how well remote work really worked. Jon Rymer is principal at Lynch Consultants, former Inspector General at the Department of Defense. Dan Levinson's former IG at the Department of Health and Human Services and the General Services Administration. Gentlemen, welcome. It's great to see both of you. Dan, I start with you. What happens during a shutdown historically to Inspector General offices that this bill might prevent?
Well, Francis, as a general matter, I would think that most IGs are affected by the discretionary spending that is the heart of a close down. But with HHS, actually, my experience personally as the IG there was that we were minimally impacted by it because so much of Health and Human Services monies go to Medicare and Medicaid funding, which is mandatory. So our particular IG office was far less impacted by this than most others. But I think it's a very important reform to allow IG offices to continue to work because the nature of what these offices do, and the bread and butter, of course, are audits and criminal investigations, are matters that really depend upon continuity of operations to be most effective. It's an addition to IG function that would be very, very valuable.
Jon, welcome. It's good to have you on the program again. What do you see as the benefits, and are there potential challenges that continuing operations during a shutdown might present?
Well, certainly, and I would agree with Dan in terms of continuing operations and how critical they can be. But in my experience, I worked through. I just recently been appointed at the time the last shutdown during the Obama administration. And my experience was that after authorities became more clearly defined in the first 2 or 3 days of that shutdown, between what authority I had as the IG versus what authority the secretary had to determine which employees were essential and which weren't. Once that was really established, and the determination was that I really had the same authority relative to IG employees that the secretary had to the rest of the department, I had the discretion then to decide which employees were essential. In other words, which essentially investigations needed to continue, which audits or investigations could be delayed. But it is, as Dan said, critical that that a certain amount, if not all, of the IG workforce remain available to protect sensitive information, protect, in our case, in some cases, equipment, weapons, things of that nature. So continuing the ability to continue the work of an IG is very important during a shutdown.
The work of the IG in any given agency, Jon, as Dan laid out, is audits and investigations. How would one conduct such an audit or investigation into how remote work worked? Congressman Jody Hice of the House Oversight and Reform Committee is asking 10 agency IGs to do that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. How would one go about assessing the success of remote work during the pandemic?
Well, remote work, assessing how effective it's been, or assessing whether people are actually performing the work, that whole issue is really wound up in time and attendance fraud, which has really been essentially low-hanging fruit in IG offices for many years. It's not been very difficult if one were abusing, in other words, filing hours saying they worked when they didn't work. It was fairly simple to investigate that. A little bit more complicated now, that since many folks aren't actually in the workplace, so the ability to check a card reader and see if someone had actually swiped into the building and was available, that's not available to us. But there are a number of other ways with such a large electronic footprint that every employee leaves every day. There are a number of ways to look at productivity, or look at how engaged an employee was during the course of the day, whether it's government cell phone records, email use of other applications in the systems, in the department's technology. A whole host of ways that an IG investigator could determine if someone was really engaged in performing productive work on behalf of the government.
Dan, how would you go about digging into that from an IG perspective? How would you measure this person was this productive, this person was that productive, and we add it all up to figure out whether we were as productive post-pandemic, post-remote work as we were before?
You know, I think it's so important, Francis, to take a deep breath and think about the transformation that's going on in workplaces, both in the public and the private sector. The time and attendance rules that John very properly referenced and we talk about, these are mid-20th century rules that were really key to being able to monitor the kind of work that the workplace did, especially with wage grade, but as well with the general schedule. We deal far more these days with knowledge workers in a technology environment that really does allow work to be performed across a variety of different venues. And it's so important for the federal government to become more comfortable and to operate more effectively and efficiently with 21st century technology by taking whatever lessons can be learned from the private sector with respect to remote work and thinking through in a sophisticated way, because IG offices themselves are full of knowledge workers. You know, these offices have attorneys, professional accountants, criminal investigators, and professional evaluators. These are sophisticated jobs that can be done in a variety of different places. And when the job needs to get done at a particular place, these people are very good at being able to figure out where that needs to happen. And I think that's probably true across many areas now of the federal government. I would hate to see any signal from Congress that somehow the government, there's an assumption that productivity really requires the kind of 20th century workplace environment that we strained under really for too many years. We need to get modern on this, and I would like to see serious thought given to how executives and managers can think through how to maximize productivity. And it's not necessarily the IG offices that can tell these offices how to maximize productivity. Within HHS, there are many offices with tremendous and deep scientific and technical expertise that OIG personnel can't necessarily assist them with when it comes to productivity. But Congress can send the signal that productivity needs to be maximized in a modern environment. And that's the kind of signal that needs to be sent from Congress.
Gentlemen, thanks very much for your time. It always goes by very quickly. I appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure, Francis.